morning, everybody. We're going to get started again today, and this time around we are going to be working on arrays. Now, a string object gives you a way to work with a sequence of characters, and it basically stores those characters as an array. An array gives you a way to work with multiple elements of any type. So you can use an array to store a sequence of numbers, a sequence of integers for a high score list, but you can also use an array to store elements of different programmer-defined types. You can use an array to store multiple strings, for example, and that's what we're going to do in this programming example. We're going to be doing an inventory program that will maintain the inventory of, say, a hero from a typical role-playing game. He's got a small number of items to start off with, and he finds other items as he goes along. We will store those items in an array, a sequence of string objects, one for each item that is in his inventory. Along the way, he will trade out items, so we'll see how we can remove an element, remove a string from the array, replace it with a different one, add additional strings to the array, and test to make sure that we haven't exceeded the maximum size for that array. So let's go ahead and get started with our heroes inventory program. And I've got my new text document, and I will go ahead and save that. We're in week 5, so I'm going to call this heroesinventory.cpp. We're going to include IOStream, and we'll also include our string library so that we can work with strings. Okay. We're going to define our array in a moment, but first we need to define what the maximum number of items that array can store. This is required when you're defining the array, and it just helps the compiler set aside enough memory for that array. The best way to do this is by defining a constant, and so we're going to define a constant integer called max items, and we'll set that to 10. So the most number of items that the hero can have in his inventory will be 10. Now, to define an array, it looks like you're defining, in this case, a string, but to signify that it's an array, you put in square brackets the maximum number of items that can be stored in that array. This is what actually makes it an array instead of just a regular string or a regular int or anything like that. It's the fact that we have specified in the square brackets a maximum value for that array. Now, to put things in the array, we have to give them the index point. What storage unit they need to be stored in. So we're going to define an integer called numItems, set it to 0, and now we can start adding things into our hero's inventory. So we have inventory, and then in square brackets, numItems plus plus. Okay, so we set numItems to 0. This is going to put in slot 1 sort. Okay, because num items was 0, we add 1 to it, so this would translate as inventory and then the number 1 in the square brackets. Now, we'll add another item to his inventory. His armor. And his shield. Okay, so we've put 3 items into our array. When we run our program, we'll see what is in there to begin with. So we'll see out your items, and then a line break. And now we want to cycle through everything that's in our array. So we do a for loop, and we're going to initialize our counter to 0, and we're going to say that this will run as long as num items, or as long as I is less than num items, and every time it runs after it completes its cycle, it will increase num items by 1, or increase I by 1 rather, sorry. And to access the element in that array, we just say the name of the array and then the number in which we want to look, the index that we want to look at. Okay. Each element that's stored in an inventory is stored in a certain position, and the number in square brackets when we're trying to access that item accesses that index position. So we stored sword in num items 1, in inventory 1, armor in 2, shield in 3. Okay, so we'll print out that item, and then we'll print an end line. And that is the end of that for loop. Okay, so that will print out the items that are in the inventory. We'll go ahead and see how that works. I'll compile our program and run it. So you see it prints off sword, armor, shield, the 3 items that we put in it. Okay, now let's go back into our program, and after our for loop, we'll say that our hero trades out his sword for something else. A battle axe. To change the contents of that inventory item, we just specify inventory and then the index position, which is 0 for the first item. Okay, I may have misspoke up here, where we set inventory num items plus plus the first time to sword. It does not increase num items until after it has set sword. So we have inventory 0, inventory 1, inventory 2. Remembering that if our double plus sign comes after the variable name, it performs that operation after it does anything else in that line of code. So when we say inventory num items plus plus equals sword, it will look at what num items currently is, which is 0. It will set inventory 0 to sword. Then it increments num items. So in the next line of code, num items is now 1. We set inventory 1 to armor, increment num items. So here num items is 2. We set inventory 2 to shield, then we increment num items. Okay. Now back down on this line, we're going to change the 0 position element to battle axe. Now let's go ahead and print off the inventory again. For we go back to our integer I is equal to 0. We want to run the loop as long as I is less than num items. And at the end of the loop, we will increment I by 1. Same as before, we see out the contents of inventory I, then end the line, okay. And that will print out the new list, the new inventory list. So we'll go ahead and compile it again, run our program. So the first loop through your items is sword, armor, shield. Then we say that we've traded the sword for a battle axe. So now here's our new inventory: battle axe, armor, and shield. The other thing that you can do with arrays is you can determine how many characters are in a particular element in that array. For example, let's say we wanted to know how many letters a particular item contained. Say the item name, inventory, we'll just look at the 0 position. Has to determine the size of it, how many characters it has, we want to look at inventory, index 0, size. Okay, this size method will tell you how many characters, it counts how many characters are in that particular element. So I save it, and I will compile the program again, run it, and it says Battle Axe has 10 characters in it. Let's count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay. Okay, now let's add an item to the inventory. Okay, so now we're not replacing an item. We're going to add something. And in order to do that, first we need to make sure that we have not hit our maximum for that array. So we're going to have an if statement. If num items is less than max items, then we'll have inventory, square bracket, num items, healing potion. Okay. If we have already exceeded our max items, or if we are at our max items rather, then we will tell the player that they can't carry anything else. And need to wrap that code in my curly braces. Okay, now we'll go ahead and print off the inventory again. For int I equals 0. Run as long as I is less than num items. And at the end of the loop, increment I. Each time the loop runs, we have it print inventory I, followed by an end line, and that's the end of our loop. All right, so we'll save that, compile it, and we run it. Let me just clear my screen, make that a little bit easier to read the output. Okay, the first time through, we had sword, armor, and shield. Then we trade the sword for a battle axe. So now the inventory is battle axe, armor, shield. Battle axe has 10 letters in it. You find a healing potion, new inventory, battle axe, armor, shield, healing potion. If num items had already been at 10, we would not have been able to add that into our inventory. If you don't test for that, you can try to add without testing for it, but what ends up happening can be dangerous. This is called an array bound, the maximum number of items that can be stored in an array. Remember that your array has a fixed size. You create that integer constant to store the size of the array, like we did in the very beginning of our code with our const int max items. If you don't check to make sure that you're not going over the bounds of the array, it's hard to tell what's going to happen. If you try to access an array element outside the bounds of the array, you're accessing some unknown part of the computer's memory. Worst case scenario, if you attempt to assign a value to an element outside the array bounds, your program could do unpredictable things. It might crash. It might just not error at all, but not store the information. So it's important to make sure that the index number is a valid array position before trying to use it. There's always a chance that you're going to exceed that index, that maximum index value. So you want to make sure that it's a valid index value before you go on and try to use it. Hopefully that helps you understand how to work with arrays and what they do, what you can and cannot do with an array. There are a lot more things you can do. You don't have to simply trade an item out. You can insert an item at a particular position, which will bump everything back. And we will work in that regard a little bit later on. If you're interested in doing that, all of the documentation is there. If you look further ahead in the book, I believe he covers that later on in the book as well, using the pushback method, the append method, the different methods that apply to arrays. So This is just a basic starter on arrays, using them and how to use them, and we will work more with them as we progress through the semester. So hopefully you're able to get through this code. If you have any problems, email me. Let me know that you want to come in for office hours or post on the help desk forum on Angel. Thanks a lot.